Hello, Write the Docs. It's such an honour to be here. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for sticking around to watch this. So hello, or as we say in the north of England, hey up me ducks. So just to quickly explain as well, because I'm not sure that the word panhandling particularly works very well outside the UK and America. It basically just means begging for money on the street. I had a few people comment that some people here might not understand what it means, so just a bit of clarification. Before we go on, just a little bit more about what I do at Mozilla. I write loads of documentation about web APIs on MDN, so I found the research talks about web APIs really interesting. That was great stuff. I also head up the MDN learning area, which is a series of articles aimed at teaching complete beginners how to do web development, client-side web development from the ground up. I've written about 80 articles, 80 tutorials this year so far, and it's never going to end. There's so much to write about. I'm also a total accessibility whinge bag, so with all of these new and interesting technologies we have coming out all the time to allow us to build shiny and cool web stuff, I still believe that the universal access aspect of the web is the most sexy thing about it, and we shouldn't forget that. And then outside work, I'm a heavy metal drummer, so if you come and talk to me afterwards, please speak slowly. This is the obligatory heavy metal drumming slide, and I'd like to dedicate this to my good friends Sam and Kay, and all of the other awesome metalheads that we have here that I've talked to so far. Another thing I'd just like to state for the record, the slides are already online at slideshare.net/ChrisDavidMills, so don't worry about taking lots of notes, just sit back and enjoy the silliness. You can give comments to me at Twitter, ChrisDavidMills, and cmills@mozilla.com. So I suppose I'd kind of like to clarify, what exactly I'm going to be talking about. The whole panhandling thing, the begging thing might make some people think of this, but this is not particularly what I'm talking about. Although, sometimes when you're trying to get a large volunteer community to help you write stuff for your large documentation project, it can feel a bit like begging sometimes, but this is not particularly what I want to focus on. It's more going to be about looking at different feedback mechanisms, which ones are most effective, how do we do it on MDN, and also turning feedback into contributions, which is kind of like your holy grail of feedback. So, feedback mechanisms. This is my favorite picture from the internet ever. I'm going to discuss a few feedback mechanisms and discuss kind of how effective they've been in my experience for getting feedback provided for a large documentation project. You may have had different experiences and disagree with some of this, but hey, mileage does vary with feedback mechanisms. First of all, email. So, we do a heck of a lot of email at Mozilla. We have lots of different mailing lists for different purposes. And I think, email is very effective in a lot of different ways. It's the old school, everybody has email. Everybody can get access to it without trouble, from techie expert nerds to complete beginners. It's easy to share a lot with email. It's easy to write down a great big thesis in terms of what your feedback is on a particular page or whatever, and share code examples. It's also very easy to funnel and separate. You can say, if you want to give feedback on this particular documentation, write to this mailing list. Or you can separate two threads out if something's starting to become convoluted and mixed in terms of the discussion. It's also great to get community involvement. On the MDN public mailing lists, quite often the community members jump on queries and feedback and answer it, and it's absolutely great for that. The cons really, it's not sexy. Email is very archaic and old school now, so I have heard some people kind of complain about it and say, oh, well, we should just use Slack instead. It's like, yep, fair enough, but Mozilla is kind of built on email, really. Often you can also slip into one-to-one conversations. I lose count of the number of times that someone's reminded me or I've reminded someone else, well, you answered that piece of feedback, but you only responded to the person asking the question. Include the mailing list so that everybody can benefit from that answer. The other thing is as well, when you're working on lots of documentation, having to switch over to an email app or an email page to answer email support queries, it can take you away from the docs and kind of disrupt your workflow. IRC and live chat. I've put live chat in the same bucket as IRC because essentially providing feedback, it pretty much functions a very similar mechanism. It's really, really useful to have this immediate form of synchronous communication. We have quite a few bits of feedback sent to us on IRC at MDN, quite a lot of people commenting saying, well, there's a typo here, or this piece of documentation seems wrong. And it leads to rapid fixes, because that kind of really quick fire fix stuff, it's quicker for you to just go and fix it rather than to write it down and with a mind to go and fix it later half of the time. It's good to have these synchronous conversations to strike up relationships with people. Great for community involvement in the same sort of fashion as email. I really like IRC. Only problem really with IRC is you can't share things quite as easily. It's more difficult to say, well, I wanted to discuss the finer points of this particular block of code and have a huge conversation about it. It's a little bit harder. It's not persistent. Now, I know that's not necessarily true because, of course, with things like Slack, you do have recording of history, so you can get back to the messages that were sent when you weren't there and weren't looking at it. But it's still not quite as effective as something like email or a forum. It's also seen as really archaic and geeky. It's not quite so user-friendly for non-technical people. They see IRC as being a bit scary. The average non-technical person, when you say, oh, just go to this IRC chat room, they're like, what? And it's also harder to filter or scale dealing with feedback than something like email. So, with email, it's asynchronous. So if you get a lot of requests, you don't have to answer them all immediately. You can prioritize ones and get them handed out to people to answer. But with IRC, it's okay if you're just getting a couple of bits of feedback per hour or per day or whatever. But if you suddenly have a huge amount coming in, it just starts to become unmanageable. People really appreciate synchronous communication and rapid fixes. It engenders a lot of trust in your community and your users, but if you get too much of it, it just completely ruins that, so you have to be careful with it. Forums next. Now, just to explain this picture, I couldn't find a single amusing picture about forums on the internet, surprisingly, but at wikihow.com there is actually a tutorial that explains how to laugh, and I just think it's brilliant. This is one of the pictures from that tutorial. Go and look at it. It's really, just the fact that it exists is really funny. So the pros of things like forums, and I'm also including in the same bucket stuff like talk pages and discussion pages on wikis. I know that they're slightly differing mechanisms, but really it's the same kind of deal in terms of feedback. These can be good because quite often they can be closer to the documentation. Your discussion page or whatever can be on the same site as the documentation page. So it takes you away from the docs a bit less. It's a bit less disjointed. Good for sharing lots of information. You can really easily see the history of something like a forum page, and it's lower effort than synchronous. Again, it has the advantage, like with email, that you can actually prioritize and you don't have to answer things immediately. The trouble with things like forums is they require constant curation to avoid rot. They can suffer if you haven't got somebody constantly cleaning them up all the time. Very quickly information on there and feedback can start to rot, and you're like, oh well, how old is this piece of information? Has that been fixed yet? It can become a bit of a nightmare to maintain. Also, as we've seen with stuff like the PHP docs, your forums and discussion parts can actually turn into the docs, which is really great that you've got people providing that feedback and that input, but at the same time, it starts to become a bit annoying and disjointed. You're like, okay, so we've got half the information up here in the article and then half of the information down here in the comments, and it becomes a bit annoying and hard to curate. Again, it can be a lot of work. Social media. I couldn't find anything funny about social media at all on the internet. I lied, of course. So this is pretty much sums up social media for me. Social media is a great thing for feedback on a large documentation project. It's very low effort and pressure. It's very easy to throw something out there and get a bunch of feedback. It can give you high coverage and engagement. We use things like Twitter and Facebook all the time for basically like pyramid marketing schemes, really. You throw your new doc out there, the URL, and somebody else throws it, passes it around. It's really good for that. Also, if you're just trying to find something quickly, or you want a quick bit of feedback on one very specific point, it's really good to throw a question out there. I can't find the page that explains this, and I'm feeling lazy, so can someone throw me the URL? It's great for that kind of feedback, because obviously everybody wants to prove how clever and correct they are on social media, and it's really useful. The cons, of course, is that you don't get such a good conversation or contribution. You know, beyond a really simple, quick-fire bit of feedback, it's no good for like a structured conversation, particularly. The focus can quickly shift. You know, you can end up with loads of people weighing in, and very quickly the conversation diverges to somewhere you didn't really want it to go. Very low signal to noise. And of course, the real danger of social media is you don't know quite who's out there. It's not quite as controlled a group of people, and it can quickly turn toxic, so you have to be kind of careful how you manage your conversations. Issue trackers is another great big one, or bug trackers, or whatever you want to call them. This is a huge thing for us at Mozilla. We have a Bugzilla instance, which now has about 1.5 million bugs on it, I think, at the last count. And at Mozilla, we do pretty much everything over Bugzilla, from your obvious stuff like engineering implementation details to accounts and legal tasks, and even HR and stuff like that. We have special documentation bugs and other such things. It's great for community involvement. Again, you can have the community coming and handling bugs and even being mentors on bugs for other people. Great for searching in history. It's very easy to find the history of what's happened on a particular bug or issue. The information rot is not quite as problematic, because you know you've got the ability to say, right, this is closed now, it's been fixed, forget about it. The only cons really I see with issue trackers are, again, it can pull you away from the docs and kind of break your workflow a bit. Just like IRC, things like Bugzilla can be very intimidating to non-techies. You know, we quite often will say to somebody, if we haven't got time right now to fix a particular documentation issue, we'll go and say to somebody, you know, could you file a bug about that, please? And sometimes it's like, no, I don't know how to do that. It can also require a lot of engineering overhead and perhaps be overkill for a smaller documentation project, although with GitHub being set up the way it is and being able to use GitHub issues as an issue tracker, I think, you know, there's no reason really why any project should not have an issue tracker. Community events. This is what the average MDN community event looks like. You know, don't mess with our community. Great for making relationships, having everybody in a room together, something like a conference like this one. You know, fantastic. You have really high quality conversations. Good place to get really deep understanding of different problems, understanding people's feedback, very high quality, high signal to noise. Of course, the main problem with community events is they're costly and they're time consuming. And then you get this thing, don't you, of community events where you go to a really good conference and you're really inspired and you write down 500,000 lines of notes, and then you get home and go, oh, I need to act on all this stuff now. It's going to take me like a week, you know, or half a year. This is one of the problems with it. So I also wanted to talk briefly about automated feedback. We've found this to be very useful for getting feedback on certain things at MDN. So automated feedback can be very unintrusive, especially using things like A/B testing. So we've used A/B testing in the past on MDN to say things like, you know, well, what's the best color to have the edit button so that more people will click on it, and we test it with a small subset of our users, and then we see if the number of edit clicks is higher on that small subset than it is with just the general population of users. MDN is built on Django, so we can use Django waffle flags to just dole stuff out to a small subset of users. That's very useful. I mean, we do have some weird things with A/B testing. One of the weirdest things we had is loads of people wanted social media sharing icons on MDN. Good old social media sharing icons. So we did some A/B testing and we tested them in different positions just to see, you know, what position do they have to be for most people to use them. We found a good position for them. We put them live on the site in the production code. Everybody hated them and complained. So, surprise, surprise, people are more sane than we first thought. And so we moved them to a different position where people complained less. Then nobody used them at all, so then we just got rid of them. So the cons of automated testing are, obviously you can collect very specific bits of feedback like that, but they're not really good for any more detailed kind of feedback. You've got a bunch of initial engineering overhead to put them in, and you also obviously don't have any contributional relationships because, hey, half the time the people don't even realize they're giving feedback, especially with things like A/B testing. So with that, I'm going to start talking a little bit about MDN and how we do things on there. So a little bit about MDN for those who don't know what it is. Mozilla Developer Network, we document the web platform and a whole bunch of Mozilla internal tools and technologies. So things like Mozilla Developer Tools and other such stuff like that. We have a writing team of 6 people. And we have a global volunteer community of 1,000 monthly contributors, which is really quite exciting stuff. We have over 4.5 million readers per month, and we have loads and loads of pages. These figures are fairly accurate. We did a bit of studying the other day to get them a bit more accurate. As you'll see, we have very large swathes of documentation in various different locales. And it's quite incredible, really, because some of our different localization groups are very vocal, like, for example, the French community and the German community. This definitely has something to do with the fact that we have French and German speakers on the actual paid staff team. But we have other groups, such as, for example, the Japanese or the Russian localization groups that we never talk to, ever. They just get on in the background and do their localization work, and we never even hear anything from them, which is quite amazing, really. And as I've sort of alluded to a lot in the previous sections about the different feedback mechanisms, some stuff works really well for Mozilla, mainly the mailing lists and the IRC, and of course the Bugzilla system that I talked about. And we've had some success as well with social media and A/B tests. The main stuff that really hasn't worked for us is anything that requires constant curation of another separate mechanism, such as talk pages or separate forums and things. You know, with the sheer amount of documentation we have, it just wouldn't make sense with the number of people we have available. We don't really have the mechanism to actually deal with things like that, so we just haven't as yet. So with that, let's talk a little bit about acting and responding to feedback. So I don't know if any of you sometimes feel like this when you actually get some feedback, but yeah. The dude abides. So at Mozilla, we have this thing called the fire hose, which basically describes the flow of work through Mozilla. It's kind of chaotic and flies everywhere, and there is just so much of it that you kind of feel like you're drowning in work sometimes. I'm sure a lot of other people in this room probably have the same kind of experience. But what it all leads to is that prioritization becomes very important. Now, our main tool really for collecting feedback in terms of documentation requirements is Bugzilla. We have specific documentation bugs where people will say, you know, here's a documentation bug, these particular pages need to be changed because the code's wrong or there's typos or whatever. But what we also do is we have a special dev.needed keyword that we tell all of our engineers to put on any engineering bug, which is going to result in some docs needing to be written. So we get them to do that pretty reliably these days, and then we can use our automated tools just to grab all of the bugs that have the dev.needed keyword and then use it to start prioritizing the work that entails. When we've finished a particular bug, you know, we've documented that API that was implemented on that bug. We then changed dev.needed to dev.complete, so that we've got a record that that piece of work has been done. And we have basically a roadmap of prioritized major tasks, and we do these as part of agile sprints. We also have a whole bunch of paper cuts and associated fixes and little minor bugs. Now, a lot of these are associated with a particular release of our software, so we group all of these little tiny paper cuts together in great big bugs and do them as part of our agile sprints that we're currently working on. So this is quite, you know, we can sort of say, okay, here's 75 papercut bugs, the fixes for all of which were implemented in, say, Firefox 49. So we try and make sure it's done by the time the release actually comes out. And then when we've got all of these different things prioritized, we then give them out to the different members of the team to try and shepherd to completion. Of course, this system does work well most of the time, but we do still have problems with some work just going into a backlog, which acts as a kind of black hole. And this is really where our volunteer community comes in. We pass a lot of these kind of random paper cut stuff that's sat in the black hole to our volunteers to deal with. Now, this brings me to turning all of this feedback into contributions from volunteers, which, as I've said earlier, is kind of like your holy grail, really. But it's pretty tricky. So a few more statistics. We have over 20,000 now total contributors. And what I mean by that is 20,000 user accounts actually signed up for. because to actually just view the content on MDN, you don't need an account at all, but you just need an account if you actually want to edit the site. Almost half of these contributors only ever do one edit, and then they just walk away. You know, somebody will go, you know, this typo on this page is annoying me enough that I'm going to sign up for an MDN account, and then they just fix it and then walk away, never to be seen again, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But only 3.5% of these people have made more than 30 edits, and only 0.2% have made more than 500 edits. So this sounds like terrible news, doesn't it, in terms of the pure statistics, but it's still very significant. So as I say, we have all of these amazing localization groups around the world that do big localization efforts on MDN content. 75% of the English pages are created by MDN staff, but most of the non-English pages are created by volunteers. And we did a measure of kind of, you know, how much work had been done by staff and non-staff, and the work done by non-staff was equal to 3 times the amount of work done by the staff. So that's pretty darn significant. How do we improve contributions? Yeah, it's a wiki, and we wish people would just edit stuff and not whinge about it when it's just a typo. You know, it's this kind of edit it yourself, you dumbass kind of thing. It's a wiki, but we even have comedy conversations around the office, around our private IRC channels, saying things like, you know, how much bigger do we have to make the edit button before somebody will actually just click on it and edit, you know, fix that problem themselves? But of course, we need to be kinder about these things, because of course people know there's an edit button there, but the problems tend to be more like to do with confidence. You know, you hear quite a common piece of feedback, which is people sort of say, okay, well, I know I could go and fix that thing, but you know, I'm only just like a web developer on the street. Surely if I go and try and change that page, someone's going to shout at me from high above, kind of thing. You know, you get this kind of feedback all the time, so it is pretty difficult. You know, what we do have a bit more success with is whenever there's a specific type of work that we're trying to get done, such as, you know, we want to fix all of these paper cut bugs, or we want to get people in to help write beginners JavaScript articles or something like that. We send mail outs, you know, regular communications out on our email channels and things, and you quite often get people responding, at least initially, saying, hey, I'd like to help, but you need to make sure that you granularize your tasks as much as possible, because, you know, quite often I get the situation where somebody comes in and says, hey, yeah, I really want to help out. You know, I'm really into teaching beginners web development, so I'll tell you what, I'll write all of the CSS layout module of the learning area for you. And I think, no, you won't. After sort of realizing exactly how big writing an article is as a piece of work, they generally just disappear and don't come back. So it's much better to, from the start, give them pieces of work on offer, such as, you know, write a code example demonstrating this particular method or something like that is a much more reasonable sized piece of work for someone to actually take on. The other big issue with giving tasks out to volunteers to do, even if they're interested, is making them actually findable. Because, yeah, we have various big lists of things volunteers could do. So we have Trello boards full of information. We have doc status pages, which have a load of automated information on them about, you know, how many pages exist in this particular area of the docs that are tagged with various tags such as needs example or needs content or needs review, you know, needs copy edit or needs technical review, these kind of things. But it's still quite hard for people to pick their way through all of these huge pages of stuff and find something they're definitely interested in. What is a bit more successful is one of our developers called Josh Matthews created an app called Bugs Ahoy. And that's a nice little web front end that allows you to just basically filter the kind of bugs you want to find. You might think to yourself, well, I just want to work on a couple of bugs in the Firefox rendering engine, or I just want to work on some MDN documentation bugs, and it'll give you a list of bugs that have been listed as good first bugs. And we also have mentored bugs as well, so people can sign up to be specific mentors for bugs, so you can actually have a mentored bug if you're a beginner that just needs a helping hand to make your first contribution. So that works a bit better. One thing that you really need to do to get the best out of volunteers is to harness passions. So whenever someone comes in and says, I really want to work on improving accessibility docs, or I really want to work on helping to improve the beginner's learning material because I'm really passionate about education, it's that kind of thing that you need to jump on and make sure that these people are looked after. You know, I do a lot of mentoring sessions myself to both teach people how to use the editing tools, but also give them tips on code style and writing style. Sometimes we do get people that are slightly more mercenary about it. You do quite often get people that basically go, well, I want a cool t-shirt. And I'm like, okay, well, right, help us with some docs then. It's like that can work. And then also quite common is students that come in and say, well, my professors said that I need to do some contribution to an open source project as part of my degree. And you give them maybe 6 or 7 pages to write, and then they'll do that and just disappear. But that's fine because we've had a contribution and they've got what they want. So that's all good. In terms of mentoring people, I think this is a really interesting issue, really. You have to take mentoring people very, very slowly and just keep it realistic in terms of what they can do. Ask them, go, okay, so you want to write about these specific things. You have to make sure that they've got the prerequisite knowledge. It's like, as an example, I had a fairly terrible experience, really, with this lovely lady who randomly came to one of our meetings and said, I really want to help with doing API reference docs. And I was like, right, well, that's fantastic. Do you know any JavaScript? And she said, no. And I was like, right, I don't think we're going to get very far here, I thought. But I tried. I gave her some beginner's tutorials to go through and kept coming back to her to say, do you think you've got it yet? Do you understand this simple question about, how a method applies to is applied in an object or whatever? And she just wasn't getting it. And after a while, she ran away screaming. Possibly. I didn't hear her scream. And I wasn't in space at the time. But yeah, you really need to be careful not to scare the hell out of people. Just give them really simple tasks and move very slowly with them. Move at the kind of pace that they seem to be comfortable with. What I really should have done, I'm just going to go to this slide first because I think it works better next, is what I really should have done with this poor lady is to find other ways for her to contribute that would suited her better. So some people aren't the best writers in the world. Some people don't know the code that well. But there's still loads of jobs you can get these kind of people to do, just doing copy edits or just doing simple technical reviews or just fixing a few typos. We have quite a lot of volunteer community members who literally will just fix a couple of typos every week or whatever. But, that's a fantastic way to help us. Some people aren't particularly good at writing and aren't particularly interested in client-side web technologies, but they might be good server-side developers, so we get them to help fix bugs in the actual MDN platform itself. That's another quite a useful contribution thing. If you've got kind of like a really boring structural update that you need to do to loads of pages that's not completely consistent, so it's not very good for being automated, throw it out to your community and say, could everybody make this change on 20 pages kind of thing? And that's really useful. Or people that spread the word and evangelize MDN to the larger community. That's also very useful. We have quite a few people that do that as well. And then fighting spam is also a really big deal on a very large documentation site. So around a year ago, we had a really serious spam problem on MDN. We just didn't really have the tools to deal with it. And somebody was writing these horrendous automated bots, which were just like creating hundreds of crappy spam pages and vandalizing loads of pages. We had to turn account creation off for a while, which was a really terrible thing to have to do, but we had to do it to avoid MDN just being eaten by spam. But we now have much better tools to fight spam, so we don't really have the problem so much anymore. But in that hard period, our volunteers literally saved our lives. There was loads of volunteers that were just helping us to ban problem user accounts and revert vandalized pages and things. So that was really cool. So I guess one little final thing I wanted to mention is about keeping people engaged. Once you've got someone to do one edit, that's great, but keeping them coming back doing more and more stuff is the key, really, and that's something that we don't currently do that well on MDN, but we are certainly working on it. Really, the best thing to do is to give them constant updates through your communication channels to say what stuff's being worked on right now, what stuff you want help with. We have regular weekly community meetings. We also have regular monthly face-to-face meetups, which we call the Wednesday Docs. And we do that in the London office, the Paris office, and a bunch of other places as well, always one Wednesday per month. And we have now a bunch of volunteers that literally only turn up to the monthly Wednesday Docs and do some contribution during that face-to-face meeting and then disappear until the next month. So that's cool. I think really what I'd love on MDN would be for some sort of reward or gaming system. Gamifying doc contributions would be really useful, getting some sort of like eBay-style stars or something and little badges for people that do a certain number of edits or whatever. That would be really good. I mean, the idea that I had the other day during lunch actually is if we could get MDN connected to World of Warcraft, so every time you do a bunch of edits, you get a bit more gold or a slightly better weapon or something, I reckon we'd get quite a lot of contribution, but I don't know really how to realise that, so it's just an idea for now. But yeah, so that's basically it. Thank you for listening to my crazy drivel, and enjoy yourselves. Thank you very much.